First up, we have our keynote speaker, someone with over 20 years of global experience in the games industry and who has recently deployed over $3 billion in capital during his time at Zynga with the acquisitions of companies including Gram Games and Peak Games. And last week oversaw Zynga's biggest ever quarterly revenues of $503 million, helped by titles such as Toon Blast, Words with Friends 2, CSR 2, and Harry Potter Puzzles and Spells. With a talk entitled What Does the Future Hold? Here is SVP and Head of Corporate Strategy, M&A and Business Development at Zynga, Chris Petrovic.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. I guess we should add the word former to my title, as I recently left there a couple days ago to spend some time with the family and enjoy the holidays. But I'm super excited to be back engaged with MEGS. My only regret is that we're not in person in Montreal. It's one of my favorite cities in the world. But hopefully this will be an interesting discussion nonetheless. So let me just start a little bit by giving you the boring details of who I am and where I've been. As you mentioned, I've been in the space for quite a long time, most of that in and around mobile, pre-smartphone, pre-app store even. And much of that time in mobile has been in gaming. So, we talk about the crystal ball, we talk about the future and what it holds. And, my first caveat here is that I don't think I know very much more than any of us here on this call or presentation. But, that's the great thing about opinions is we can all share them freely and hope that one day they pan out that the way that we think. But, it goes without saying that we are the biggest industry in interactive entertainment, and I think the good thing about that is that for many of those years, as this bubble here of gaming has gotten bigger, there was a disconnect within the rest of interactive entertainment around the reality of gaming. But I think that has since come to pass, and I think that the industry, broadly speaking, in entertainment, I think the industry of finance, and I think consumers worldwide are taking notice and supporting this. The continued growth of gaming, and especially we've seen it most recently, with the unfortunate circumstances that we found our world in with COVID, that consumers have flocked and continue to flock to gaming as a source of entertainment, escapism, competition, and social interaction. And so, the punchline here, as we've all known in this industry for a very long time, is that gaming is here to stay, and it's only going to get bigger. So obviously, a lot of words on this screen. Thank you to our friends at Superdata. We break out digital games into many different platforms. We talk about interactive media as also being an emerging arena, and many of us play in one or more of these arenas. I think what this slide, why I like to show this slide is because looking back several years ago, mobile was on the far right end of the digital games ecosystem as related to console and PC. And I think for those of us that have been in mobile from the inception, it's been tremendous to see the meteoric rise of the category. And with that, brings its own levels of success, opportunities, and challenges. I think if one thing that mobile has taught us relative to PC and console is that the next generation of great gaming companies will be built on the back of the best practices that mobile, particularly mobile free-to-play, has brought to the market, which is low barriers to entry for consumers, 24/7 live services, and the ability to reach consumers in an instant worldwide, and with increasingly longer game sessions. So I'm excited for what the future holds for us as an industry, and I think that in the context of what I'm focused on talking about here is, one of the big questions that comes up is, well, where is all the money going to come from to fund that continued growth? And many of us here on this call and in the industry, it's hard to know what to believe sometimes. When you see competing headlines such as this, on the one hand, why aren't investors showing up? On the other hand, game investments are hitting a record levels that we haven't seen before. And I think not surprisingly, I tend to fall in that latter bucket, which having been involved in companies that have deployed capital as well as received capital, I think there is a renaissance that has happened here in gaming that has been driven by innovation, that has been driven by mobile and free to play, and has been driven by some of the future trends that we're going to talk about on the last slide here. And it's suffice it to say that, despite what this first headline says, there is no absence or lack of investors. I think what we've seen is that the makeup of these investors, for the most part, have changed from when gaming was in its infancy. When gaming was in its infancy, it was very much a blue ocean where investors of all shapes and sizes flocked to deploy capital, first on Facebook and then on mobile. And since then, obviously, there's been some growing pains that the industry has had, and a lot of those what I'll call daytime investors have moved out of the market on the premise that they are not very well situated to predict which teams and which games and which products and which services will fare over the others, because they fear it's a hits-driven business, and so that's not something that they know how to handicap. There have been some traditional investors that have continued to stay in the ecosystem, as evidenced by the record amounts of money that are coming in. I think recently Playco announced a $100 million Series A that was led by Sequoia, who's a traditional investor. So that's great to see. But what's more exciting is the landscape of financial activity being driven by bespoke funds that are focused on the category of games. And you can see here on the top, this is a very, very small sampling of the larger ecosystem, but hopefully have taken examples from various parts of the world to show that there is broad reach of capital on the venture and growth side. These logos up here represent U.S., European, and Asian and Middle East funds. So just from this small sampling, you see that there's a huge reach of early venture and growth funding that's available to us as an ecosystem. Many of these organizations focus on what traditional investors are afraid to or cannot focus on because they don't have the expertise in really understanding the games industry, understanding the craft of making games, understanding the lineage of founders and CEOs and management teams that have been through this before and have worked in various contexts before and have taken those learnings in an attempt to try and bring something new and innovative to the marketplace. So I think this is the very important foundation and underpinning of what's going to continue to drive innovation and investment in the gaming ecosystem, is these very genre-focused or category-focused funds. And I know you'll hear from Makers Fund and others later today, so I'm sure they can tell you more about what they do and how they approach the market. And as a strategic acquirer and investor, like I was at Zynga, we have partnered with a few of these companies to further invest in the ecosystem and give back to the early stage market so that we can watch that innovation take form. So obviously beyond the venture growth, strategics have been very, very active. And, obviously Zynga, a little bit of a selfish comment here, I'll say that we did our fair part to stoke the intensity of capital deployment from strategics through M&A the last 3 or 4 years, but we are by no means the first or the only to do that. Obviously, Microsoft had their huge acquisition recently. Tencent continues to be active with Douhu and others in China. Stillfront and Embracer in Europe are very, very active, and Epic Games is as well. Again, this is a small sampling of the larger ecosystem of strategics. There are companies out there like DDM and Game Invest that more granularly track every deal. And if you're interested in a full landscape report and analysis, those are great sources to go to understand the full arsenal of who these investors and strategics are. So finally, at kind of the end of the funnel, once you've gotten your venture money and once you've been courted by strategics, if you have successfully navigated through those two, you have a very healthy public markets arena waiting for you, both through traditional IPO as well as through this, newer, not really newer, but a revitalized investment vehicle called SPACs that companies like Skills and others have taken advantage of. But this just goes to show that the public markets are now also acknowledging the importance and sustainability and future growth potential of gaming companies. We have not seen this volume of public market activity in a very long time. And again, going back to what I said earlier, the incumbent companies that were what I'll call the first generation great gaming companies in the public markets, Activision, EA, Unity, Take-Two, et cetera, they will continue to be there. But my prediction is that we will find ourselves increasingly talking about the next generation great game companies, whether it's ones that are already public like Zynga, whether it's some or all of these on the list. And again, the differentiation will be that they focus on live services. They focus on free to play for the most part. They focus on monetization of different kinds, such as advertising. And they are best positioned to take advantage of what I believe are some of the more important future trends for us, where capital will continue to be invested in. So I'll pull all these up at once so we can talk through them. For me, this is just a personal opinion. I think, looking at these past slides and thinking about where the future is going and where the money is going and where the focus is, as I talked about the next generation great game companies being free to play, I think the other component of that is the promise that cross-platform holds. And I do think that in 3 to 5 years from now, most, if not all, gaming companies will no longer refer to themselves or associate with a singular platform. So, for example, my former employer Zynga currently is viewed as a mobile game developer and publisher. I think in the future that company and others will just remove the mobile moniker and just be developers and publishers of great games that can live on a myriad of devices and platforms and screens. Now, that's not to say that every game that a company makes in the future needs to be or should be on more than one screen, but these enabling technologies such as 5G and cloud gaming are what's making this possible. And so I'm very bullish on the future of gaming as being cross-platform, and that has a lot of implications in terms of opening up the total addressable market and audience for games that have traditionally focused on one platform and allowing investors to take advantage of these larger market opportunities. So besides 5G and cloud gaming as enabling technologies for cross-platform, a lot of money going into esports. For me, that is a tremendous consumer engagement platform, but still needs to flesh out a little bit more of a business model for investors that can show venture returns. But I'm sure we'll get there just given the engagement levels of how consumers are viewing and engaging with and interacting with this content. Hyper-casual is obviously something that has garnered a lot of attention, and I participated in that through the acquisition of Rollic Games. I believe that is here to stay, whether in its current incarnation or in subsequent incarnations, where you blend the best practices of hyper-casual with the best practices of more traditional free-to-play mobile games, where you actually bring on and sustain audiences for a longer period of time. So I'm very bullish on that as well. And then we talk about these other technologies like VR and AR. To me, that's a longer, farther afield view. I'm not as bullish on those markets just because the total addressable market hasn't yet been proven to me. But hopefully in the future, that will be the case. So I think in terms of, my talk here and looking at some of the trends, where the money is going, the robustness of our industry, I'm very bullish. I think we should all be bullish. I think there's plenty of capital, plenty of talent, plenty of exit paths, and plenty of consumers to address and yet to address in this global gaming market. And I'm super excited at what the future has for us in the next 5 to 20 years.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris. Very interesting there. I'm just going to remind everyone that if you want to ask Chris any questions, you can pop them into the chat area of Pine. I'm going to ask some questions in the meantime. I'd like to follow up something you just mentioned there about cross-platform.
Yes.
I think you see some companies really embracing this. I think like Microsoft, for example, they're looking across different platforms. Some companies are perhaps more resistant to this than others, certain mobile companies. So do you see there's going to be a tipping point in the next couple of years where games, certain games have to be on certain platforms, and the bigger platform holders will just have to give way?
Yeah, I think there's going to be inherent pressure and tension on the platform holders. We know that it's that cross-platform screen that I have is a very rosy picture of that really doesn't describe the inherent technological business and operational challenges associated with bringing games in a synchronous fashion, and particularly across a multitude of screens, with mobile playing a major part in that. We've heard about Sony being "quote unquote" open for business to allow cross-platform. We know that probably is not as clear-cut as they would like it to seem. But to me, the Fortnite effect has been the tipping point for us as an industry, because what that has shown us is that consumers are increasingly expecting and demanding that a single expression of a game can and should be accessed and played across a multitude of screens. And that in an ideal world, that those users would like to be able to play between and among each other, regardless of which device they're on. Now, again, technologically, that isn't perfect today, but I think as Fortnite and Roblox and Minecraft and Hearthstone and PUBG and others have shown, there is an appetite, there is a demand, and there is a pathway to delivering mega blockbuster games that are not only successful on a primary platform, but have relative measures of success cross-platform. And so I just think, look, from an entertainment perspective, we have long since not had to think about the viability of watching movies or videos or listening to music or reading books across a multitude of screens. And games has been that last entertainment vertical that has not yet fulfilled that promise. And there are valid technological reasons why that has been the case. And I think some of those technological reasons and challenges, specifically speed of light issues, will continue to exist, such that not every game can work with equal measures of precision across these. But as we bring more of the mass market mentality of mobile games to the market, and we show that some of the games that I mentioned are not the highest fidelity games per se as native console and PC games, but they show that because of their democratic approach to being free to play and to being accessible to all consumers, and they can opt in or not to these games, it shows us that it is possible. And I think it will only get better with, again, these enabling technologies like 5G and cloud streaming that will just further be able to push the boundaries of what's possible.
Yeah, it's interesting you're saying that, obviously, because we've got Xbox Series X that just launched. I've got my my Xbox Series X in the back there, ready to open up, and got PlayStation 5 launching imminently. Do you think that this will eventually move quicker once we get rid of the boxes? Once we go into cloud gaming, do you see that as being the moment when we really go into kind of multi-platform?
Yeah, and as somebody that worked at GameStop and started their digital ventures group, I was very, very, my first view of that was we have to be mindful of that. It's not when physical discs disappear. That's not if, I should say, but when. And at the end of the day, that reality is going to take longer than we all think, because there are inherent benefits that the average consumer has to buying discs, and whether new or used, and you have a physical product, you can trade it, you can pay less for it. It has some social currency and real currency attached to it. But I do think that eventually, as we've seen again with our other media, DVDs and CDs are a thing of the past, and I think that that's going to be the same case for gaming. And I think that will then hearken to not only the decimation of retail sales of software. I think those retailers will be left just trying to figure out how to sell hardware and subscriptions. But it will also, to your point, foster in the next wave of innovation around cross-platform, assuming that the platforms themselves allow the creative ecosystem to play nice and remove the barriers, to being able to have interoperability. And I know that these are walled gardens that have their own reasons, but I think ultimately my hope is that consumer demand and pressure wins out, because I think at the end of the day, all these companies have to be mindful of the fact that we all service the consumer, and we need to provide them with the best experience. And if we don't, they'll find it elsewhere.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to sort of investment and funding now. So when you were at Zynga, what makes a good fit for the company when you're looking to acquire a company?
Yeah. Boy, that's a very loaded question, but it starts with a tremendously strong team. Our processes, as the leaders of these companies that I've acquired can attest to, our processes are very, very long, and most of that time is spent on the relationship and trust building side of the equation. And I know it's a corny metaphor, but I equate M&A to effectuating a successful marriage. And what I mean by that is that there's a courtship process where you get to know each other. You come over to their house, they come over to your house, they meet your family, you meet their family, you spend time with them. You realize that you speak the same language, that you have the same interests, that you see the world the same way.
Yeah.
And then you get to the harder part of convincing them that this 1 + 1 = 3 equation is possible. And that relies on a lot of genuineness. You have to really be genuine in your view. You have to be genuine in your intentions. You have to be genuine in what you can provide as a benefit to an acquired company. And if you pass that, then you go to the stage of getting married, and you're charting a course, hopefully, where you'll be married for a very, very long time. And different companies have a different description of what a very long time means. But for us, it was, and for me in particular, I've prided myself wherever I've been on establishing those relationships, establishing the trust, being transparent, and really ultimately wanting to set up a structure where both sides see a benefit, and that 1 + 1 = 3 calculus comes up. I think too often in this industry we've seen deals that have been done for disingenuous reasons or opportunistic reasons. We've seen deal structures that have been done such that the acquirer sets it up so that they're pretty sure that they don't have to pay future consideration or an earnout, for example. My mentality has been the opposite. I want to pay you every penny that we have agreed for you to make, because if you're successful, my company and I are successful, and that 1 + 1 = 3 calculus, bears itself out. So I think it's really that long arc and continuum of relationship building, trust, and leading to a successful marriage.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, for companies that are perhaps at the stage where they are, looking to be acquired, what are the processes that they need to go through? How do you? Is it a conversation that you have when you already have a relationship with a company like Zynga, and you kind of, it's like it's kind of the natural next step?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different pieces or strings of advice that people in the industry give to answer that question. One old adage is that great companies are bought, not sold. While that may be true in some cases, I think that's too blanket of a statement that doesn't necessarily hold true, because not every company has the same set of circumstances in its operation and in its structure that allow it to make decisions the same way as a peer company does. So at the end of the day, you have to make, as a company, your personal decisions on what you want to do. That starts very early on in your discussions with yourself, your co-founders, and your investors and advisors and board members. But I do also stress to companies, whether they're 1 day old or 1 year old, that you have to have the mindset of having the company well buttoned up from a preparation perspective. And what I mean by that is not that from day one you're thinking about being acquired or you want to sell yourself, but just the best practices and hygiene of establishing a company that has best practices around data, around bookkeeping and finances, around operations, around human resources, around analytics, around taxation, all of the things that make you a good corporate citizen. And especially if you keep those books in good order from day one. And I know that a lot of startups run fast and hot, and they forget about those things or don't focus on them from the early stage. And then when it comes time to do it, then you're kind of reverse engineering into things that should have been there from the get-go. And it just makes for a less efficient conversation and a less efficient engagement process with a potential suitor or acquirer if you're not prepared. And by the way, it also foments an opinion that an acquirer may have about whether the company is really ready to engage in these kinds of discussions. So, best practices around operating and forming a company and how to manage it are important, regardless of whether or not you sell, because eventually, for your investors, whatever your end goal is, that preparation is going to come in handy. And then the other bit of advice I give is that when there is an ultimate decision made by the leadership to explore a sale, whether it's because of inbound interest, whether it's because of circumstances of the company, get yourself a quality advisor, because one thing that I've seen way too often is that taking all of it on yourself as a founder or a founding team is a very time-consuming, laborious potentially distracting process that can take you away from the core focus at hand, which is running the business on a day-to-day basis and making great products and services. So, get yourself a great advisor. There are, a great handful of them out there around the world, and you know them by name or reputation because they've been involved in a lot of deals. And so I think that's super helpful. And those are my two kind of main areas of advice.
Good stuff. You've talked obviously a bit about the future and crystal balls and things. What's the kind of big excitement for you regarding business models at the moment? Because everyone seems to be talking about subscription being the big one at the moment. And, is that something that you can see becoming increasingly important in the next few years? And is free to play still viable and still good for companies like Zynga?
Yeah, I think free to play is always going to be viable, and it's going to be the foundational business model that wins out over the other end of the spectrum, which is premium. I think on the subscription side, that sits somewhere in the middle, and ultimately it's determined by what your primary platform is and where you're deploying your game first or primarily, because subscription means something different, for example, on mobile than it does on PC and console. But I do think that subscriptions are going to play. It's going to be a good bridge, if you will, from companies that are going to have to come off of the premium model but aren't ready to fully embrace free to play 100%. So I do think subscriptions is going to gain in importance and popularity. And I think especially because one business model that is more established than microtransaction-based business model across all these platforms is subscription. So I think that is going to be a good bridge and gap, and how that gets deployed in a cross-platform world will be very interesting because, again, by and large, we're still dealing with a customer base that has different mindsets and mentalities when they decide to pick up and play a game on one device versus another, even if it is the same game. So, but you also have to make sure that you have a uniform business model that doesn't provide an advantage or disadvantage to customers on a specific platform. I also think advertising, as I mentioned earlier with hyper casual, and I think advertising is going to continue to be important in light of or in spite of the upcoming, privacy changes that are happening and data changes with IDFA and what's going to happen as a result of that, because ultimately the industry will find solutions either in parallel with the platforms or directly with the platforms, because it's just too big of an industry and we have too many innovative companies and people in it to not figure out solutions. And we've been faced with a lot of different kinds of changes from the platforms before from a rule set perspective, and we've always come out stronger in the long run on the other side. And I have no doubt that the same will be true here. So advertising, especially when we think about the fact that there is a pretty material portion of the world that is still considered emerging market, that hasn't yet quite gotten the critical mass penetration of smartphones. And those earlier stage emerging markets tend to not be as liquid in terms of their bankability to pay for microtransactions and subscriptions. So advertising is potentially a lower barrier way to monetize. And obviously with hyper casual and other ad driven types of games, and given the amount of money that's flowing from a marketing perspective in the ad ecosystem from games as well as non-gaming brands, advertising will continue to play a major part. With mobile driving that, I think we'll see it less on places like console and Switch, but perhaps PC is another arena where we can embrace that again in an appropriate way. And I know it's always a hot button in terms of how appropriate is advertising in games, and ultimately, again, like I said before, the consumer sentiment wins out ultimately on what they will and won't accept. And I'm confident that advertising will continue to be a material part of the gaming ecosystem going forward.
Yeah. No, that's great. We were chatting about it earlier. I suppose we've got to address the elephant in the room, which is about the current pandemic and how that's affecting investment. I mean, how do you see it at the moment? Across the landscape in the US and Canada, and how do you see that affected? Has it affected investment, or has it just kind of meant that things have had to happen perhaps more slowly, or what is it like at the moment?
Yeah, it seems like to be a tale of two cities for me, because on the one hand, if you see the news that's coming out, driven by a lot of the companies on that one logo slide that I had, you would think that we were not facing any exigent circumstances in our society and that deal making is going at the same clip. I think that, there's a certain part of that that's true, which is on the bookends of early stage investing and public markets. Early stage investing is obviously, built on more risk and perhaps anchoring more on teams and reputation and quality than it is on actual scalability and commercial success of a product. And on the public market side, once you're at the public market stage, all the companies need to see are your financials that you've demonstrated enough scale and success in order to warrant going to the public market route. So there really is not as much need to perhaps engage in that interpersonal live relationship building exercise that I talked about. So I do have somewhat of a concern on that middle part of the strategics and the M&A, because of how much, at least from my perspective, the best practice is to be based and driven on relationship building. And obviously we're in a position right now where we can't do that as effectively as we once could. And hopefully we will get back to that. So this will just be a temporary blip. But in the meantime, I think what many of my peers and I have been doing is just maintaining those relationships as best we can telephonically or through video and email, and really over-indexing on that, on the belief that we will eventually be able to see each other in person. But I also do think in the meantime that those companies that do M&A, that have a distributed workforce of management and M&A capabilities, rather than being in one singular location, will ultimately be able to survive and thrive more succinctly in this interim period that we're during this COVID period that we're experiencing, because success can come from any part of the world, as we've seen in gaming. And so to be able to be close to there, or to have, I'll give you one example. So the Rollic Games acquisition that we did in Istanbul was smack in the early to mid stages of the pandemic in the summer. And we, as a management team, were a little bit nervous because we weren't going to get a chance to go out there to Istanbul to see the team and get to meet them, and they weren't able to come see us. But a couple of things helped us. One was our reputation in the industry up until that point, especially in Turkey with Peak and Gram Games and the Zynga Turkey studio, gave them a lot of comfort. And then for us, the comfort was that we had executives on the ground in Turkey from those three studios that could be our proxies for doing the in-person diligence. So from that perspective, we were very lucky and fortunate to bring on such a great team because of those circumstances. But if we were to find a studio that was in a far off place where we did not have those people on the ground, the bar would have been a lot higher for us, especially with the material amount of money that we were being asked to spend on an acquisition. So it's going to be interesting to me to see a lot of the deals that we also saw in the early part of the pandemic were vestiges of relationships that had been built before then. So obviously with us and Peak Games, that was a relationship that was many years in the making. And we were well advanced in that process by the time the shelter-in-place orders hit. But I do think there's going to be a little bit of perhaps quality control issues on the M&A front, the strategic space, if they're not able to execute their normal playbook of the interpersonal relationship building and the in-person, the in-person exchanges.
Yeah, that's good to hear, because I'd heard a couple of funds had were concentrating on just their own portfolio and weren't expanding so much. So it's good to hear that companies like Zynga are still looking out for companies and looking to invest. I was going to ask actually about just a last quick question before we finish, actually, just about sort of different parts of the world. And you touched upon investors from the States and from Europe and the UK, like LVP. Where are the exciting things happening at the moment regarding investors? Is it kind of globally, or is it would you say there are certain sort of hotspots at the moment that are particularly good for investment?
Yeah, I think if you asked me that question maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I would have anchored on certain hotspots, and I think those hotspots still do exist. Montreal to me within North America continues to be a hotspot, one of the best ones in the continent. Helsinki, London, Istanbul, obviously the Asian market in of itself is one big hotspot. But I think fast forward to today, and as I mentioned earlier, you have equal measures of likelihood that success can come from a small village in Kirkutsk as it can in San Francisco. Yeah. And so I think that the world is now a hotspot as gaming has matured And, the folks that have come from those traditional backgrounds or have come from the traditional geographies that have scattered around the world, either from an operational perspective or an investment perspective. Play Ventures is a great example. They're a small, team of two games industry experts. One is in Singapore, one is in Helsinki. So they have a great, overview of the global landscape. V Games is a new fund in Israel, and Israel is produced a lot of great gaming and gaming related companies. Makers Fund, obviously, and is global in nature. With even though they may be based in Asia, LVP is in London, but they have almost 50% of their investments outside of Europe. So there's I think capital can flow anywhere. I think talent can be found anywhere, and I think that's what makes it exciting, is that it isn't really limited anymore to just a few geographies. Although the few geographies that I mentioned are still chock full of great talent and volume. And I think that's also what plays to the advantage of those geographies, is that places like Montreal and Helsinki have tremendous talent. They have tremendous backing from the government in order to foster innovation and investment. And then they have the commercial investment on top of that. So I think that great teams and great products will be discovered because our data is pretty transparent, at least in the mobile side of the business, in terms of being able to track that. So, I think it's a global village right now for gaming, and I think that makes it tremendously exciting in terms of our growth potential.
Fantastic. Very positive. That's great to hear, Chris. And unfortunately, we've run out of time there, but thank you very much for joining us today, and good luck with your future endeavors. Whatever you're up to, stay in touch.
My pleasure. Absolutely will do. Thank you for having me.
Good stuff. Thank you very much, Chris. We're going to have a short break now, 5 minutes, and we'll be back very soon. Thank you very much.